Hi, I'm Maria Elizabeth Molly, and this is Relationship Alchemy. Today, we are talking about reimagining modern manhood with my guest, Carlos Andrés Gómez. Carlos appeared on the HBO series Def Poetry Jam and the show Verses and Flow on TV1. He has also co-starred in the Spike Lee movie Inside Man with Denzel Washington and is the author of the memoir Man Up, Reimagining Modern Manhood, released by Penguin Random House, and the beautiful poetry collection Fractures. Above all else, he is a proud father of two, and we know each other from back in the day in the poetry world, and I'm just so excited to get to interview him today because I just have loved him for many, many years. So welcome to the show, Carlos.
Maria Elizabeth, it's always wonderful to see you and a joy to chat with you. You're one of my favorite people, so thanks for inviting me on the show. I'm excited about this.
Yay. Thank you for, well, first of all, thank you for saying yes, because I asked you basically at your gorgeous recent poetry album release party in New York, which also wasn't mentioned in your intro. So Carlos has a beautiful poetry album. It's out on Spotify. And do you want to say a word about that? Your collaboration with Brent and everything?
Sure, yeah. My best friend Brent Shuttleworth and I is one of the most brilliant creative people I know. We've done a couple of albums together with another friend of ours, producer named Joe West, and the albums are Volta, the most recent one, and the one before that was called Opus. So yeah, you can find it on all streaming platforms. But yeah, it's check it out.
Yeah. Oh, so good. So I want to talk about this topic. First of all, I was so happy to see it when you began speaking publicly about wrestling with manness and manhood and what it is to be a man today, because I think it's a topic that we really need to talk more openly about. And yet it seems like it's so hard to talk openly about it. So would you talk a bit about your decision to share openly and where that stemmed from for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it's rooted in just growing up as this very sensitive, tender-hearted, nurturing little boy in a very machismo culture. And I think, whether or not your listeners or viewers right now, um, whether or not they would use the word machismo, but just whatever the culturally appropriate or relevant word is for them, I think a lot of us even still live in cultural contexts where they're very rigid and um, very limited notions of what it means or what it can mean to be a man. And I know there's been so much that has shifted, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, around masculinities, plural, and also gender, and across the continuum and off of it. But in the environment that I grew up in, it was very much there are two boxes. There are two genders only that exist, which we know is obviously false. But in the environment that I grew up in, that was the only option. And there's only basically one way to be a man. There was no talk of masculinities, plural. I didn't have a lot of models of what masculinity could look like in ways that wasn't homophobic, in ways that wasn't seeking to dominate, conquer, control everyone and everything around them. Um, I think for me, it became a real, literally an existential crisis for me. I think I got to I spent years and years trying to be a person that I was not. And I got to the end of my teenage years and I was just filled with despair, and I felt, I think, despondent about the rest of my life. And there were a few different catalysts that kind of opened doors and allowed me, sort of invited me back to myself. One was the great poet Martin Espada, that who came to my high school when I was 17. And I think, gave me permission really to be a poet. Um, the story I tell is I was 17, I bought a copy of Imagine the Angels of Bread, and he looked at me and he saw that I'd been crying, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "You're a poet." And I was like, I hadn't told him anything, and he took my book and he wrote Para Carlos, Poeta del Futuro, Martín Espada,
Oh my
for
God,
Carlos,
that's
poet of the
amazing.
future, and
Yeah.
I feel like that kind of, I think, entering spaces with artists and in artistic communities where there are much more expansive notions around masculinities and around gender. I think it ultimately saved my life. But I think that's one of the reasons. And it took me, I think, a long time to, many of the poems I wrote for years had nothing to do, were not personal, were not excavating any of my personal baggage or any of the deeper complex questions I needed to face. But then I think as I entered my mid 20s, um, I really felt a call to share the things that I was trying to excavate, because I also knew that the only ways that I could really grow were in community, which were much the same way that I think about being a poet, which I know is very different than in the traditional literary white canon, where they talk about people sitting in a cabin and writing by themselves. I've never thought of being a writer like that. I mean, of course, there's a lot of
Yeah.
time you're writing by yourself, but I've always thought of writing and art as something done in community, and something done with mentors, and something done alongside other people, literally and figuratively. And so I think that was also, maybe with that model, that's also the way I thought of my own personal journey with wrestling and reckoning with how I consider masculinity. And I think that journey has allowed me to engage with a lot of men in a lot of different lived experiences across the US, across the world. And uh, as much as I've seen things shift and evolve in a really positive direction, uh, there's always the pendulum swing. It's like people who, when you're a student of history, you look at the civil rights movement and people think, oh my gosh, that era was a really progressive era. Like, no, yes and no. It was also one of the most conservative eras in American history. There's that, reaction. I mean, you know, the, the amount of the US population that supported, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement is the same. The people who supported it is the same small population of people initially that supported Dr. King for most of what he was doing. Which
Yep.
is to say, like, more than 2/3 of the U.S. did not or does not support Black Lives Matter, and more than 2/3 did not support Dr. King, whatever story they tell now. And so I think when I go across the country and I go across the world and I talk to men, I talk to boys about masculinity, I sadly still see so many people struggling with the things that I struggled with. And, just to put a bow on it, because I could talk for like an hour about this, but I think I, the work that I do through my art is an extension of my personal work. And the beautiful thing to watch it, kind of things come full circle, not about a rival, but about watching things move in a kind of circular trajectory, is these characteristics that are authentic to who I am, me being sensitive, emotional, nurturing, tenderhearted, collaborative, curious, verbal, seeking help, all those things that I was made fun of because they were feminized, which is part of the patriarchy and misogyny and sexism that were pervasive and still are.
And I
um,
want to say that we are
yeah,
all subject to, right? I mean, because we
100%,
harp so much on
100%,
how women are affected by patriarchy, but we don't talk
100%.
enough about how men are affected by it too.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
But all those qualities that I was so, you know, maligned for have ironically become my most vital tools as a husband, as a
Mm.
father to two kids, as an artist, as a speaker, as an educator. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a little snapshot, a very long-winded snapshot of the journey that kind of brought me into this work. And again, it's just an extension of my own personal path.
Well, and thank you. I didn't find it long-winded at all. I feel it was perfect. And two things really stuck out to me. The one being that shift from, because I remember your earlier poems being much more political and about outside things that were happening in the city, in the world, in our
Sure.
culture. And then as your work began to turn and wrestle with more interior stuff, like that's an important fulcrum. I think it's worth going into. And the other thing that stuck out to me too was in your list of personal qualities that you were maligned for, that bit about seeking help, because I think
Mm,
that is something that is so frowned upon somehow, and it creates such a harmful environment to all of us, really, and especially to men who are supposed to keep it together and never cry. And I've had other men on the show who have also expressed like, "Hey, I'm a feeling person," and
yeah.
when I've showed up in a feeling way, because that's what's true for me, sometimes I've gotten pushback, even from women that I'm dating about like man up and all of that. And
Hmm.
so,
Hmm.
so I'd love to, whichever of those two things I just said feels more resonant, I'd love to
Sure.
go deeper in there.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll go chronologically. I mean, going with the first question you asked about the kind of shift to wrestling with and excavating, interiority in my work versus having it all being things that were just naming things externally. Uh, Shout out to brilliant poet, educator, Pulitzer Prize winner Tyson Jess, who um, many years ago. And it's funny because he actually wrote a really nice blurb for my chapbook. Um,
Mm.
and he actually remembered this story, but I didn't know if he would or not. But many, many years ago, I mean, it must have been, I don't even know how long. I mean, literally, I think it was probably literally 20 years ago. Um, he was a judge in a poetry slam that I was in. Both of us at very different points in our growth and development as people, because we talked about it and we both laughed about it. But he gave me a point one at a poetry slam. He gave me a point one after I did a poem, and I remember it was because I got like three tens, uh, like a 9.9 and a point one. And I remember he came up afterwards and he said, "Your work has no courage," and he was like, "I don't see you anywhere in your writing. That's why I gave you a point one. I think you need to show yourself in your writing because otherwise there are no stakes, and I just don't care." And he walked away. And I remember like really taking that in. And I didn't even like know who he was. I was like, who is that? I asked like Marty or something, Marty McConnell, and she was like, "That's Tyamba. Like, Tyamba is somebody worth listening to," And that was also part of this community thing, is just keeping it very, being very candid with each other. And I think that was the beginning. I think the gift of that moment with Tyamba was it was the beginning of me recognizing that a few things. One was that I was getting up on stages and screaming at my father, and that's most
Yes.
of what I was actually doing. I actually needed to actually work on my relationship with my father and go to therapy and work on myself before I could actually inhabit the the writer or the artist that I was meant to be, or I'm always trying to become. Um, and so yeah, I guess I would say that was a really important shift for me, a really important gift that Tyson Jess gave me. And yeah, I mean, and there were other mentors who challenged me in that way, but I think I was really terrified of showing myself because I was so sensitive. And I
Mm.
think this kind of ties into the second thing you brought up, which is that I think so much of my life, I've always had a lot of intensity, but in a very contrived machismo narrative kind of way. I think that secondary emotion, that shadow of an emotion that hides another real emotion. Anger was the thing that I would always reach toward because I
Yeah.
felt like that was the only way that I could powerfully or safely share the things that I was feeling. And I think that as an artist, I think anger and rage were like the one note that I played. And because the culture in New York, like, anger plays well because
It
everyone's, "Oh,
plays
fuck
well
you.
there.
It's New York,
Yeah.
fuck you too."
Right, right.
And so like
10, 10,
yeah,
10 in the
yeah,
slam.
exactly. And I was always comfortable being a public speaker, so I had a lot of experience even before I was a poet. So I was comfortable in a space in front of people, but I wasn't really showing any of who I was. And then I
Mm.
think a long series of things of like taking uh, acting and theater workshops and developing a play and moving into acting stuff allowed me, I think, to take off a lot of the masks and take off a lot of the armor so that I could be
Amazing.
present in my body in front of people. But I think, it's something that I still struggle with now. I have a really hard time even now. I mean, I've come a long way, but still asking for help. Um, and I think that it's something that it's really important. I think about a lot too, modeling, especially as a parent to my kids, because I know, kids don't care what you say, they only care what you do. Like they don't do what you
Yeah.
say, they do what you do. And so I think for me, I try to model for them like when you're emotional, you don't apologize. It's okay to be emotional. We're humans. It's important to ask for help if we can't do things. Um, and I think it's something, and to be clear too, this is beyond gender. I mean, we all have
Yes.
these culturally inflected narratives around not asking for help,
Oh,
whether
yeah.
it's being Colombian or being, from a Black Southern family like my wife, or being, it's like, no, I gotta just push
I
through and do
see
this.
it, I see it in the high performers I work with, like how hard it is,
100%.
when you're a woman who's invested in being independent and powerful and
Yes.
strong
Yes.
and a
Yes.
go-getter, to
Yes.
to ask for help, it gets it conflated with weakness, which it's not.
100%.
It's
100%.
vulnerable and weak are not the same thing, but I think in our culture we have
Yeah.
that super confused.
Or even just like setting healthy boundaries across your life, and that being a way to even infrastructure a life of support, versus, where you not where hopefully you don't have to get to the point where you're like, I'm about to drown, please grab my hand.
Exactly. I don't know if this has been true for you and your wife, but
Yeah.
as Patrick and I were falling deeper and deeper in love, and we've been together
Yeah.
7 years now,
Wow.
there have been points where he actually had to say exactly that to me, because I have
Yes.
had a
Yes.
habit of waiting until I'm drowning
Yes.
before I ask for help. And he'll be like,
100%.
knock, 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 like, you don't have to be drowning to ask. You
Let
can
me
just
help you.
ask because
Yes.
you want some support.
Totally. 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 And it's funny. No, yeah, I 100% resonate with that. And that's something actually my wife and I both struggle with. I
Mm,
think we both, we both come from, I think, habits of like, whatever you're going to categorize it, high performing, high functioning lives. We're both hyper independent people. So even the premise of like a relationship can be challenging at times, with how independent we both are,
amen.
and I think it's funny because, um I have I'm not as much of like a control oriented person. I'm very much sort of like a kind of a Taoist, but um and so I'm much better with conceding and
Mm,
releasing the control, or the sort of decision making role on things that I think are not, they don't have high stakes attached to them.
yeah.
It's one of these things that just in a relationship, that balance, because then like my wife will seek it out and fight for it, and then not want to have it when she, and then that's also knowing the rhythms and kind of the waves of your relationship or partnership, where there are times where it's funny because she'll seek that, but she's not decisive, and I'm very decisive,
Oh,
but I
that's
don't.
hilarious.
But the irony is that I'm very decisive, but I'm also hyper aware of not echoing my father in his
Yes.
marriage that was not successful. And so I'm very reticent about taking on like a role that feels like I'm kind of domineering in any kind of way, but I'm very comfortable making decisions, like huge decisions, small decisions. I make them in 2 seconds, and that's just my personality, you know. So yeah, just I don't know. I was just thinking of that, even in thinking of Patrick, and the ways that when we know each other deeply, and we love each other deeply in partnership and in relationship, intuitively knowing, of course, we have to express the desires we want, can't read each other's minds, but also knowing those ways, when those moments where you step in. And I do the same thing with my best friend, who I've been in relationship with for 27 years, and we kind of know those waves, like, okay, now I got to step in for Brent, or Brent's like, no, now I got to step in for Carlos.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do we do that really with kindness as opposed to
Yes.
frustration or something,
Yeah.
like
Exactly.
how do we sort of like, oh, you know what? I see you're doing that particular wobble. I know that thing. Like, is
Yes.
this a spot to step in, where it's coming from
Totally.
compassion?
Yes.
I just want to shout out the Taoist piece, because Patrick is such a Taoist also. Like, and when he discovered, he had never read the Tao Te Ching, but a few years
Yeah.
ago in a spiritual workshop we took together, we read
Yeah.
texts from different traditions. And
Yeah.
when he got to the Tao Te Ching, it was like the heavens parted and
Yes.
the
Yeah.
the light shone on him, and he's like, it me. And he began
Yes.
listening to it nonstop on Spotify,
Wow.
because it's on
I
Spotify,
love it.
auditory,
Yes.
like the
Okay.
audiobook.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so for the next 2 years, I would hear some version of like, some sutra would come out of his mouth at
Yes.
various times, because
Yes.
he was
Yes.
just steeping himself so deeply in what felt like home. So So it's funny that you also have that kind of outlook, because there is a way that he is much more easygoing with things too, and he can also be more decisive in certain spots. And so
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think in relationship with one another, like any marriage, it's good to know what the strengths are of each person,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
where that person tends to wobble, and how to actually support each
Yeah,
other's strengths, especially when they're
totally.
complementary, right?
And I think that can also be like, it's it can be both simple and complex. Or what do they say? And they say, in acting, like it's extremely simple but extremely difficult just to be present, you
Yes.
know, and hear somebody, and and I think about, in relationship, it's like there are both roles that each of us really enjoy taking on and roles that we're really good at. And I think some of
Those
those,
aren't always the same thing too.
absolutely, they're not always the same
Yeah.
thing, exactly. And they're also, some of those either align or don't align with some of the sort of contrived gendered narratives that we grew up with. So both of us are having feelings about that as well. You know what I mean? Like I love to cook, and my wife loves to cook. She like really loves to cook though. It's like a place she feels free, she feels seen.
Mm.
So it's just like a role she wants to take on. But I'm kind of like, can we balance this a little bit better? But she doesn't want to release that. But then I see that I'm like, oh gosh, or there are things that we might be good at, but we don't enjoy. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
she's good at like cataloging, and she's a librarian and an information technology specialist. So she's good at cataloging things. She loves an Excel spreadsheet, but she hates doing taxes. So I do our taxes. You know what I mean? Even though I'm a poet, it's like
Amazing.
those things where even though somebody may have a higher capacity, their bandwidth once it gets the time to do it is like, I don't have it. Can you do it? And it's like, okay, I'll be the one to do this. And so I think it's like
Yes.
that kind of dance, and learning how to do that in a way that's graceful and not clumsy, I think in a perfect world is something over time we get better at
I
when we're
agree. And
comfortable with
also
people.
that piece about letting go of the gendered part of it, and really looking at the individual strengths
Hmm.
regardless of gender, because Patrick
Sure.
and I have some spot. I mean, he's the one who loves a spreadsheet, so he does project management. He
Yes.
does the
Yes.
cataloging. I'm a creative, chaotic being. It's very
Yes.
hard to
Yes.
contain me.
Yes. Yes.
And I need rails, but I don't know how to make
Yes.
the rails, right? So often
That's
he's
you
the
and me
one
both.
making, yeah,
Yes.
right. So like
Yes.
he's the one often sort of making rails, and then I have to learn how to, be free inside of them,
Yes. Yes.
which
Yes.
is a beautiful gift on his part to do that,
Totally.
even if I sometimes resist. But it's it, but in our case, like I'm the primary breadwinner, and so we're
Yeah.
bucking that gender trend because
Sure.
I'm the
Sure.
one supporting him in, because he's practicing golf, he wants to turn pro, and so
Yeah.
right now I'm the one that supports us, and so
Yeah.
and so we've had to negotiate. Again, he's pretty fluid about that, so it hasn't been like a
Yeah.
major problem, but every now and
Yeah.
then there'll be some little gender like thing that
Sure.
comes up
Sure.
around
Yeah.
finances, where and I'll be like, it's okay for you to spend money here. Like it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he'll
Yeah.
he'll feel like, oh, I shouldn't spend because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
make it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so it's just very interesting to be in a relationship where we're gendered for sure, and
Yes.
we're also beyond the traditional roles in a certain way. And it sounds like you
Yes.
two are navigating a similar flexibility.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think about every single day of my life, of course, I feel like I keep doing talks or interviews and referencing this quote, and I can't find it. But there was a quote from a friend of mine, brilliant feminist journalist, Mona Eltahawy. Um, but I think she's Egyptian American, and she has this quote where she said, like basically something along the lines of, home is like the front lines of the revolution because all dictators go home. And I think about
Yes.
something along the lines of that. Look up Monel Tahawi, whoever's reading this. She's
Yeah.
brilliant. But yeah, but I think about, people talk about, what, I get asked this all the time. I think all of us are agents of change for better or for worse, whether we recognize it or not. So I'm a bit resistant to words like activist, but people often put that word on me, which I have
Mm.
mixed feelings about. Um, But, people always ask, like, what are you doing to, to promote, you know, racial justice or gender equity or whatever it might be. And, I mean, to me, I think about like what is happening in your home is the front line and the back line of whatever other work you're doing. Because I think about the modeling that we're doing for our kids, and I think about they watch the way we talk to each other, they watch the way we share roles, they watch the way like invisible, unpaid labor is distributed in our home. And I think about that every single day of my life. I think about all the
Mm.
tasks in our house, think about all the roles in our house, think about all the labor in our house. And then again, also being clear eyed though about like my wife adores cooking. It's a place she feels purpose, she feels seen, she feels creative, she feels release at the end of the day, all these things. Like I happen to make more money and make and be able to expensively make a lot more money than my wife. So I'm the primary breadwinner, and that just makes sense to me. I always tell her there are moments of that too where she has feelings about that, and I'll say, listen, I say, if you were a CEO or like the starting, like shooting guard for the Atlanta Hawks, like you would cover everything. You know what I mean? Like this is just logic. It doesn't have to do with gender here. Like this is just logic. It's just the way it works out. I feel like these moral attachments to money are, connected to white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism and
Completely.
all the things that we're trying to dismantle. And even if we consciously know that, it doesn't mean that it's not deeply internalized in our bodies. But I'm always trying to like distance myself from that. I'm like the reason I make so much money is also tied to a lot of these really destructive systems,
Yeah.
that I benefit from in ways that my wife cannot and hasn't.
Right.
So, I'm trying to like think in more humane and complex and holistic ways about all that. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, I really resonate about that. And again, like I think it's so easy when people think about transformation. And I know my sense is you're very in touch with this, but listen, if we want to transform out there, we got to transform in here. We want
It
to
all
transform the
starts here.
world, we got to transform in our home.
Yes.
The pebble hits here and the ripples go outward.
Amen.
And I think so often people want to be out here. It's like that transformation can't happen if this is not happening here. So
Well,
um, I'm always thinking
and
about
what
that.
you're saying ties so beautifully back to what Tayimba said about the poem that he scored
Yeah,
low, because that's really the crux. People want to
absolutely.
feel you. They want a person. They want
Yes,
work and a life that emerges out of the depths of our being. And if we
yes,
spend all our time kind of skating on the surface and being outraged about everything that's going on outside, but not grappling with the depth of our self-hatred, the depth of our,
absolutely.
conflict, inner conflicts, the depth of our confusion about gender, the depth of our hurt from our upbringing. Like if we don't grapple with that stuff, we just are perpetuating harm, basically, and
Absolutely.
also
Absolutely.
perpetuating a culture that just also skates along on the surface and
Yes.
feels free to yell at each other on the internet. It's
I
just so
know. I know.
weird.
I know. I know.
So that's one of the things I love about your work, especially the recent work I heard on Volta, is it's
Yeah.
so deeply grappling with being human and
Yeah. Yeah.
with
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
a connectable and
Yeah.
connected person.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when that shift finally, I think I started to really actually turn inward, really, to actually start to create art that was connected to something real, where I really showed myself. Um, you know, I realized in many ways there were all these poems that had been living inside of me for all these years that were waiting to be written. Like I'm Colombian, like I grew up with stories everywhere. Like storytelling is everything. I mean, every family gathering, my tios are telling stories till 2 or 3 in the morning. I mean, I'm from the land of Garcia Marquez. Like, like I mean, I think about and so I think and that's something that's been characteristic of my work since that shift. Um, many probably, I would say probably 15 years ago in earnest, I really made the pivot. Is, I think most people who know my work, they think of my work as very uh, personal narrative, anchored in personal narrative. If you look at fractures, if you look at obviously my memoir as a memoir, but the things that I've written, or even essays or other things, I've written a couple plays, they're all rooted very much in personal narrative, and using that as a frame, ultimately through lived experiences, to reckon with those larger issues I was trying to speak toward before. But they're done in a way that's, like you said, is connected and is resonant. And I think where the stakes are clear because it's connected to a lived life that is my own, you know, rather
Yeah,
than
absolutely.
platitudes and
Right, because that's the thing. Otherwise, it becomes this sort of righteous self-righteousness and these platitudes,
totally,
and
totally,
you can kind of feel you can get your yayas out in a certain way, but I
totally.
don't think it's transformative in the
No,
same
no,
way that sharing work, like your work of the last 15
yeah,
years, it's transformative because we can feel ourselves in it, whether we feel
yeah,
ourselves in it in agreement or we feel ourselves in it like that's not my experience, whatever
totally,
the feeling is, you can't bypass it because it's real.
totally. And I think it's one of those things too. It's, I think about, um, and now I maybe miss, um, I think it was Jericho Brown that said this, but if it's not Jericho, sorry, Jericho. And Jericho Brown's probably said this in another interview, but I think it was Jericho Brown saying in an interview where someone was asking him about basically like that initial feeling where you feel called to write a poem, and the person was saying, like, they always say that, you write a poem when you got something to say. And Jericho said, well, I actually don't think it's about having something to say. I think it's me wanting to investigate something.
Mm.
And there's something I want to ask a question and I want to hold under the light. And that's where I go to have a poem, because I don't trust an answer that's going to emerge from a poem, but I do trust that, like, a more profound question. Of course, I'm paraphrasing wildly, and if this is
But
totally
it's
wrong,
beautifully,
sorry.
yeah, but I
But yeah,
get the gist, and it's beautiful because and to me, what an incredible orientation toward life too, because
yes,
one
yes,
of the things I see a lot and obviously take issue with is
yeah,
we rush to opinion, we rush to
yes,
judgment, we
yes.
rush to
Oh my
platitudes,
gosh, yes, yes,
and it's just
yeah,
all of it is bullshit. It's all like a
yeah,
stay against feeling
yes,
and a
yes,
stay
totally,
against not knowing. And
yes,
it's
yes.
kind of like
A forced
what
resolution, a
right,
manufactured resolution. Yeah,
for our own comfort, for no
totally.
other reason than
Just to
we're
make us feel
uncomfortable
good.
with. Yeah. And who is it? Was it Rilke that said, live in the questions themselves? I mean, it's kind of
Ooh,
right. Yeah. And I think
yes,
that, and if we're talking about reimagining modern manhood, like
yeah,
what a place to land, like to be
yeah.
willing to be in the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when I was doing press for, Man Up, I mean, there were like two questions that, I mean, a couple questions, I mean, that I get over and over again that I appreciated, but I feel like people had a completely false idea about their entrance into these two questions. And to be clear, when you're doing tons of interviews and press and everything else, people are probably have a 21-year-old intern who reads the back of the book for them, writes up a rushed short paragraph synopsis, which they're looking at like 15 seconds before they announce me on the podcast. So, like, I know they haven't read the book and have no context, so it's fine. And the 21-year-old intern, God bless them. I know they're like George Washington trying to graduate. Like, I
They're
totally
doing their
empathize.
best.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're doing their best. I'm not mad at them either. But people would ask me, first of all, like, the title of the book, Man Up, whew, that's a phrase that hits a lot of men a certain way. At, like, why would you choose to name a book that? And of course, the story I always say is, I say, my mother always told me that if you want to kill a monster, you turn on the lights. And so to me, that phrase was a monster that haunted me my whole childhood. So,
Yeah.
putting it in lights was to, take the power away from it. And
Amen.
to put it in a spotlight, put it in a marquee. And
Smart mama.
and the second part of that, is, people would always say, oh, and I'm going to try to I'm going to talk around this carefully, but I did not pick the subtitle of the book, either of the paperback or of the hardcover. But the hardcover was "Cracking the Code of Modern Manhood," which I'm just going to graciously say I did not pick, but was the subtitle we went with. And so on every radio show, people say, "Oh, when did you crack the code of modern manhood?" Like, I guess everyone should be you. which of course was not at all what my memoir was attempting to do or talks about at all. And I think this idea of sitting in the question is what I was thinking about, is that to me, like the greater work I'm always trying to do is invite people toward possibility and toward question and toward more profound and more humane questions. And so what I often say is I say, listen, I don't want anybody to be a man or whatever gender they are like me. I just want them to be themselves. And when I was
Yes.
growing up, I didn't have a lot of examples of people, breaking with conformity. And so any example I saw that was a foil against conformity, a foil against these contrived ways of being anything, gave me permission toward myself. So I want to be permission for anyone listening, watching, reading toward themselves. That's my hope. Don't be me. Be
I'm
yourself.
about to cry, man, because same, Venezuela, Colombia, right next door.
Yeah,
I grew up in New York, going to Venezuela every year,
yeah,
and
yeah,
Sweden. And
yeah, yeah.
all those cultures have so many rules
Mm,
about how we're supposed to be and dress and sit and behave, and especially
yes,
for the
yes,
girls.
yes,
And same thing, anytime I would see a glimmer of nonconformity, it was like
yes,
grasping for air for me.
yes,
It was like, oh, it's possible to be my own
yes,
person.
yes,
And my whole life has been a similar endeavor to you. And I exist as permission to be yourself
yes,
as well.
yes,
That's what relationship alchemy is all about. It's about the
yes,
relationship with self. How do you
yes,
alchemize the shit that's in the way of being you? And then
yes,
how do you bring that you into relationship with other people in such a way that they
yes,
have space to be them too? And
yes.
all of us grow together, so that you just have really nailed it in such a way that's close to my heart. Thank you. Phew. Okay. Uh, I don't want to put you on the spot, and feel free to say no,
Always
but
put me
is
on the
there
spot.
is there a poem you'd like? I'd love to end with a poem if you're open or
Sure,
willing,
sure,
because
absolutely,
I just want to give
absolutely.
my
Yeah,
listeners and watchers the treat if you're
yes,
willing to share.
yes. My pleasure. So, uh, I spent about 15 years going to Rikers Island and doing writing workshops with the youngest people who are incarcerated on Rikers. And for those tuning in, if you're not in New York, it's I believe it's still or was the highest population jail in the world. 17,000 people on this little island next to LaGuardia. That contrary to what my seatmate asked me on a flight about to take off from runway 13, it is not an Airbnb resort. It is a jail. But a lot of
Yeah.
people don't know the youngest people incarcerated there are children,
Mhm.
16 and 17-year-old boys, which I don't call young men because I think that's language we use to make us feel better about locking up poor black and brown kids. Because I was a kid when I was 16,
Yep.
and I always think about who we call kids and who we don't call kids. So I work with the 16 and 17-year-old boys in the Robert and Devorn complex on Rikers, and this feels fitting and aligned with what we're saying because it really is about a real moment that happened one time when I was in Rikers a few days before Christmas one year, and I would always make sure to go around my birthday, which is right before Christmas, to Rikers because that's like the hardest time for folks that are incarcerated. Um, Violence turned outward and violence turned inward because people are feeling such despair on those ritual moments of time passing and being away from loved ones or being estranged from family. And so this poem is called Morning Rikers Island. And the very short poem is, I think, self-explanatory, but um, just to give you the image, it's about 11 a.m. in the morning in the auditorium at Rikers, and the light is coming through the large windows with bars over them. And there were about 200, actually, it was boys and some of the older guys too that were in there. And yeah, this is called Morning Rikers Island. Physics and light pierce the hollow stench of the forgotten gymnasium, stripped naked of clocks. All the adolescent boys stop, offer their grief to each other like water, glancing out the only window they all share. A single ray unfolds its warmth across the dusty belly of the thudded parquet. And here's the miracle: the sun frees, everyone to sing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me here, for saying yes. Thank you for the gorgeous work you're doing in the world and for who you are being. It is a privilege to know you.
Maria Elizabeth, I'm so inspired by the person you are and the work you're doing in the world. I just love you, and I love chatting with you, and just seeing your growth in all ways gives me permission. So thank you for that. As I said last time we saw each other, always struck by your presentness and your authenticity. I feel like it's like a floodlight in every room that you were in from the moment I first met you. So very, very struck by that, and very much saw that. Um, Whether or not that was recognized by other people, I always noticed that. And I'm very grateful for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. Yeah, you're gonna make me cry again. But thank you. Thank you for seeing me, and especially at a moment like back then when I felt super unseen. So thank you for that. So this has been Relationship Alchemy, and we've had the treat of talking with Carlos Andrés Gómez today. And until next time, remember that a great relationship starts with you.